رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So, because we've been talking about a lot of concepts and aspects of ourselves, I wanted to put it in a diagram today for you guys so you could visualize the different entities that we've been talking about. And so for those who haven't been here, we've been talking about the Islamic psychological perspective of who we are and basically how to live our lives. And before I get into this topic, I want to remind myself and remind all of you that when we try to study anything, right, our goal is to study it with the intention that it's going to bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whether it's any subject, science, psychology, any subject that you love or you divulge in, the purpose is that it should bring you close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It helps us experience Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more. And then it's supposed to serve the purpose of us understanding God and knowing how to return to Him in the best of states. I mean, if we look at the early scholars who contributed greatly to what we know is like the golden age of Islam, the height of Islamic civilization that contributed to the Renaissance period in Europe, if we look at them, they're the ones who contributed so many works and pieces of literature that advanced so many of the sciences. But if you look at their work, everything started with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Everything for them goes back to the intention of understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala better, understanding why we're here, understanding our purpose. So whether it was astronomy, psychology, they contributed a lot to psychology, whether it was any of the sciences, medicine, everything to them was their study of it, their purpose was to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more and to understand, because all knowledge, right, that's beneficial who's the source of it? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So this is just a reminder, as we're studying all these Islamic psychology concepts, our goal is to think about how can I use this to strive towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how can I use this to become a better person? And not just take it as facts and say, okay, I understand now the psychological perspective of who I am. No, it has to serve that purpose, right? So today we're going to be talking about the psychology of dhikr. And inshallah, if the presentation works later, then I'll show you the diagram. But just to recap, we talked about the several entities of who we are. Our heart, right? And this is our spiritual heart, not our physical heart. We said this is the part of ourselves that holds this divine spark, this longing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this piece of us that Allah put within us to navigate our way towards Him. And the self, the nafs, right? And we said that the nafs has the lower self, the nafs al-ammara bis-su', the part of us that commands us to do evil, and then also can achieve the state of being a nafs al-mutma'inna, right? Which is the tranquil self. And we said that we have our mind, and then we have our physical self. And we said, just like I always go back to the planets, I said just as the planets need to revolve around the sun for it to be at that peaceful orbit, all of these entities need to be revolving around the spiritual heart. This heart of ours needs to be the lead for us to have a peaceful life. And I'm emphasizing this again because we need to understand this if we're going to understand the psychology of dhikr and how dhikr works. And so, our heart shouldn't be there to serve our mind, or our nafs, or our physical self. The mind is there to serve. Whatever knowledge we seek, how is our heart being absorbed? How is our, whatever we're gaining should be to serve that part of us that needs to be in the lead. And so, in our life, it's going to be a constant struggle between this heart and this nafs. And, it reminds me of, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story, but an old Cherokee was teaching his grandson about life. And the grandfather was telling him, there's this fight going on inside of me. And he said to the boy, it's a terrible fight, and it's between two wolves. One wolf is evil, right? And you can think of this as the nafs al-ammara bis-su', the evil commanding self, right? And he said one is evil, and this wolf is anger, it's envy, it's regret, it's greed, it's arrogance, it's self-pity, guilt, resentment. Think of all the negative emotions that we can harbor. Inferiority, lies, false pride, arrogance, all the things that feed our ego, right? And then the other wolf is good, And this wolf holds all the beautiful types of emotional experiences like love, peace, joy, serenity, humility, kindness, empathy, all the beautiful emotions that we know and we can experience in our life, and that's the other wolf. Now, I'm not here to say that, I don't want us to think of our nafs and our spiritual heart as two wolves, but I do want us to recognize that there are these two forces within us, we can call them. And he said this same fight is going on inside you. He's talking to his grandson. He said the same fight is going on inside you and inside every person too. So the grandson said, well, which wolf will win? And he said, the one that you feed, right? And so this really is the perfect segue into talking about dhikr, because we said that, it's all about, all of these entities, right? That we have our physical self, our mind, our spiritual heart, our ego, right? We have to look at which one are we feeding? How much are we feeding it? Which one? Because the only way one will be in the lead is the one that you're feeding the most. And I always say the perfect example is in Ramadan. In Ramadan, the reason why we can experience such peace is because you're depriving your physical self, you're depriving your nafs, but what's coming to the front lines? The spirit, your heart, right? Because that's the one that you're supposed to be feeding. Because while you're fasting, you're so much more conscious of, I don't want to say anything bad because I don't want to break my fast. So you're like, it's almost like you're putting the microscope and you're analyzing this nafs, very cautious, you're very aware because you don't want to break your fast, right? So it's important to understand these aspects within ourselves and how they interact with each other and the one that needs to be in the lead. And this is the struggle. This is a struggle constantly. It's going to be between our nafs and our heart, And I said last week that, don't hate the struggle. I like to say this every time because we're like, oh, well, why is there such a battle, Well, if there wasn't a struggle, then we wouldn't know the sweetness of victory. If you were studying any subject, if you were taking any course, if you were doing anything challenging, you wouldn't enjoy the sweetness of the victory. You wouldn't actually even gain any virtues along the way. You wouldn't gain any strengths along the way if you didn't have that struggle. Just like if you're a student, you're studying math. If you get a problem and every time you get a problem, you ignore it because you don't like the struggle, you like it easy, you're never going to gain that other concept. You're never going to learn. You're never going to attain a new level in your education. So it's the same thing with this. There is a struggle within us. Be compassionate towards that, recognize that, but then know that it exists within you. See, sometimes when we ignore a part, when we are not compassionate, we don't recognize that these two entities exist within us, we ignore it. And then we live our lives wondering, why are we falling into the same patterns of behavior again and again, right? I mean, how many of us know logically that we're not supposed to be doing something? But yet we find years pass and we're still in the same pattern of behavior. There's a lack of awareness there. We're not taking the time to focus on the aspects of ourselves that we're feeding. We're not taking the time to focus on, what's going on within me, and what am I working with. So this is why it's really important to understand the struggle within us and who we're rooting for. We're rooting for this heart to win because we know that on the day of judgment, right? Nothing will benefit us except one that comes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with qalbin salim, a sound heart, right? So this heart has to win. And the purpose of all of these discussions, the purpose of any self-help book that you get, the purpose of any motivational discussion that you attend, any book you read should be, how is this going to bring me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because if we don't make that the end goal, then knowing ourselves could lead us to worshiping ourselves. And this is the issue. Whatever you do, make sure you do it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there's so many books out there about knowing yourselves, right? But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand it from a perspective that can help us get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because if you don't understand it that way, trust me, knowing yourself could easily lead into, this self-worship. And this is what happens when the nafs, because you're feeding a different part of yourself. So when you're studying, like a person who's, say, getting to know themselves or reading about self-esteem or any of these things, do they know that what they're reading should be there to feed their spiritual heart? Because if they don't know that, if they're not conscious of that, that information that you're absorbing could go to the nafs. The nafs, the ego gets built. Now I have all this knowledge. Now I'm arrogant. Now I think I'm so-and-so, and I think I'm a big deal. This is what happens. You have your mind, right? And you have a choice. Is it going to serve my heart, or is it going to serve my ego, or my nafs, right? And this is our constant choice. This is what leads to, like, you know, when people say, oh, the knowledge got to their heads, or the position got to their heads, it's really, it got to their nafs. They got it all wrong. The mind is a rational being. It absorbs knowledge, it processes it, but then it goes somewhere that makes it either good or it makes it either, you know, negative, right? And this is what differentiates Western psychology from Islamic psychology, is that Islamic psychology says that the struggle really, you know, you see all these pictures like about the struggle between mind and heart. The struggle really is about mind and heart. The struggle really, the main struggle is about between your nafs and your heart. Not your mind and your heart. Your mind is there, it absorbs, and it is there to process information. But if it's going to the nafs, guess what? That nafs is going to overpower, and then eventually it'll also be the one in control of your mind. You know, negative emotion, negative thoughts, negative thinking patterns. So we have to understand where the real struggle lies. So before I get into dhikr, I wanted to talk about, now I want us to just focus on the heart today. And I mean, I will be talking a little bit about the nafs, but I wanted to talk about the breakdown of our hearts, right? And why dhikr is important in terms of how our heart absorbs it. So in Al-Tirmidhi, he says that our heart has 4 layers, okay? And I'm not going to go into depth about all these layers. I want us to start out with the outer layer, and that's al-sadr, the breast, right? And so he says each of these layers holds a light. So the breast think of it as the sadr is the outer layer, okay? And then think of you have another layer within your heart. And then you have another layer, and then you have the core of your heart, right? So he says this outer layer is the sadr. And this holds the light of practice, of the outer form of religion, basically. And then all the other layers are heart, inner heart, and then the innermost heart. You could call it the kernel or the core of the heart, right? And so each of these layers allows us to experience a different light, a different perspective. And you know, it's interesting because if you notice in the Quran, and they're all part of the heart, right? But it's interesting because in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't always refer to the heart by saying qalb. Sometimes he says sadr, right? For example, when he says yashrah sadrahu lil Islam, right? He expands his sadr to Islam, his breast. He doesn't say qalb, right? Because think of your sadr as your first layer, oh, perfect, thank you. Okay, so here you go. This is the diagram. And let me go back to showing you oh, I'm using the wrong, this one. So this is the orbit that I was talking about before. And just so to give you a visual, so we said the heart, spiritual, not physical, self, the mind, the physical self. And then you have, this is the orbit, right? And the heart, I made it the biggest so you guys get the picture. And this is the struggle. Now see here, this is a Western picture, like this is a picture that says it's the brain and the heart, but I want you to picture this as being like your nafs, you know. Okay, so these are the layers of our heart. And so you notice the sadr is the outer layer, right? And think of it as your first mode of interaction with the dunya, with your nafs. Think of it as that's the part of you that's interacting with the nafs. First interaction. That's like the meeting place, right? So they're interacting. The nafs, if it's not a nafs mutma'inna, if it's not one that already has succumbed to if the heart is not overpowering, then the self, the lower self, is going to bring in there what? Negative tendencies, right? It's negative habits, it's negative tendencies, it's negative emotions, jealousy, all of these things that could inflict that part of ours, that first mode of interaction. So, and we have to be careful of that, because what are we trying to do essentially? We're trying to protect our hearts, you know? And, hold on one second. Yeah, so Allah differentiates in the Quran between sadr and between and between qalb. And I said, he says, يشرح صدره للإسلام, right? And he expands his breast to Islam, or he makes his breast tight and constricted, okay? Another verse says, so is one whose breast Allah has expanded to accept Islam, and he is upon a light from his Lord. Like one whose heart rejects it, he's comparing. He's saying, is one whose breast, has expanded to Islam and has a light from his Lord, like one who rejected it. And he says, then whose hearts are hardened against the remembrance of Allah. And then there's another ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O mankind, there has come to you instruction from your Lord and healing for what is in the breasts and mankind, and mercy for the believers. So, when someone is guided to Islam, why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say sadr, right? It's the first, because not everybody, in the Quran, Allah differentiates between Muslim and mu'min, right? A Muslim is one who practices the outer forms of Islam and, the tradition of Islam, but a mu'min is one whose heart responded, who's the mind and heart are connected. What I know and what I do and what I practice is in line with what my heart feels. So think of this sadr as the light. This holds we said every one of these layers holds a light, right? Think of this outer form, this outermost area of your heart as the one that holds the light of practice. This is what we do, what we say. Think of it in terms of the things that you do maybe on a daily basis. And then think of the other layers once you get into the heart. Think of now, like once you get into that first layer of heart, that's when Iman has entered. And then of course that Iman can continue to rise, to rise, to rise. But what happens when the nafs overpowers the sadr? Then the heart and all those inner areas they start to constrict, okay? And this is where you get the hardening of the hearts. This is where you start to get the layers. Because that first layer was almost like, what an orb is? It's like you see it, I guess the only thing I can remember is like the superheroes where they put this orb, this protective layer around them. If that's like gone through, then, then they have their weapons or their strengths, but, basically it's the first level of protection that's been broken. So let's talk about this subject. It's the first battleground, main battleground. So it's directly impacted by what we say, the words, our actions. Now, when we do good things or when we say good things, and it expands. And Allah uses the word expands a lot. Even when the ayah that I had mentioned, He expands His heart to Islam, right? So there's expanding and constricting. But we want open hearts, right? Because open hearts are, when you have a closed heart, when you're closed-minded, you're not able to see everything, right? The more your heart is open, the more you're going to be able to witness truths, and you're going to be able to to experience Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more, right? So this goes back to what we're absorbing, what we're exposing ourselves to, the knowledge that we are acquiring, and how it's affecting our this first area. This area that this sadr area, because we underestimate how much the things that we do and we say are affecting our heart. We often say I'm not feeling it, or I'm not feeling the iman from my acts of worship. We have to ask ourselves, what are we exposing ourselves to? What are we acquiring? What am I doing? What are my actions? Did I say have I been saying things that I shouldn't be saying? Have I been talking about things that I shouldn't be talking about? See, there's a process going on within us that you do, just because you don't necessarily see doesn't mean that it doesn't exist within you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks in the Quran about the layers of the heart, the heart, the different levels of hardened hearts, And we know that, it starts out as a black dot. SubhanAllah, in Islamic psychology, and it's all derived from the Quran, because, once you have these negative emotions, if you let it sit there, right? If you don't conquer it at its root, say astaghfirullah, like Imam Ghazali used to say, when you get a bad thought, right away say astaghfirullah, because then it can manifest itself into an action. Then it can manifest itself, into your heart. And this is how cautious we have to be, because there's so many things going on within us that we don't notice. but are happening. And all we're doing is we're interacting every day, we're talking every day, we're acquiring information every day, and then we're wondering what's going on with my heart. So our job is to constantly be cleansing this outer part, because what happens is this part gets consumed by the nafs, you know, then where's that nafs going to go? It's going to seep further. And when that nafs overpowers your heart to a degree, like all those levels, if it keeps going down, then we become animal-like, because so when this nafs al-amara bis-su starts to seep through the layers, we're not on guard, we're not cautious, it's going to eventually have to go somewhere. Okay? Its goal is to overpower. They actually sometimes refer to the lower self as the tyrannical nafs, the oppressive nafs, because that's what it seeks. It's like it's called al-amara, nafs al-amara bis-su. It's commanded. It's commanded to do evil, right? So it wants to consume. It wants to overpower. So trust me, if it takes power of that outer layer, it's going to keep going into your heart, deeper and deeper and deeper, until it consumes your heart. And you see this all the time. Don't we see people who are completely guided by their by the negative tendencies? Have we not seen people who are so angry that it manifests itself physically, right? Where they hit or they punch objects, or, you know, this is what happens. That person, that anger has consumed their heart, right? And this what differentiates like Islamic psychology, because it focuses on what's happening within me, which, like, there's these entities, and I have let one overpower the other. Have we not seen people who are so arrogant, you know, that they're just blinded from seeing any truth? I mean, we see people with emotional issues that are so blinded that they even have it, right? They're consumed with it. It's almost that thing that they eventually worship, right? Money has, or see, everybody has this nafs, this self, everybody has their own psychology, right? What could be your negative tendency is not going to be someone else's negative tendency, because everybody has a different upbringing. Everybody has different environmental factors that affect, you know, who they are, their personality, things that shape that person's nafs, right? So some people, it might not be difficult to be generous, right? Other people, their nafs, it's very difficult to be generous. See, within each of our nafs, we all have some type of negative tendency, you know? The key is to be aware of what they are and to not let them grow to a point where they consume that part of you that's supposed to be the lead, right? And you know, we also have to be aware that Shaitan studies our psychology very well, so he could very well use those things, right? So knowing this is empowering, because how often do we say, oh, it's from Shaitan, right? But when we understand that there's a part of us that I am feeding, there's a part of us that I am letting take the lead, you're also understanding that by understanding the psychology of my nafs, of the things, like I said, every individual has their own negative tendencies. And knowing yourself, you will know what you're giving Shaitan to work with, okay? So Shaitan knows your weaknesses. He studies you. He knows, you know, everybody's different. You know, like for one person, he'll enter through the door of jealousy. For another person, he'll enter through the door of greed. You know, so everybody has a different psychology, a different makeup. Know what is your weak point. Know the things that, you know, that drive you, the negative tendencies that you see within yourself, even if they're little, because it's so easy for them to grow without you noticing. So our job then is to guard this first area, okay? Because this is the first mode of interaction between our heart and the nafs and the dunya, basically, okay? And the best way So the best way to break through this initial layer is to understand that the best cleansing for the heart is dhikr, okay? Is the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so today I'm not going to talk about dhikr just in terms of, you know, when we say subhanallah, alhamdulillah. I want to talk about just the general remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, okay? And when we talk about dhikr, I think of all of these things. I think of salah, right? I think of your daily verbal remembrances. That's what I meant by like when you say subhanallah every day or alhamdulillah, your morning dhikr, your evening dhikr, citation of the Quran, and seeking knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing his attributes. This is all forms of us remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the part that we need to, this is where I wanted to explain first how our heart works and the layers of our heart, to know that this is your biggest tool, okay? Prayer, number one, is your first, your foundational protective layer, okay? And when I say that, because you will notice that if you start to get, be negligent with your prayers, it's like a downhill cycle from there, okay? So your prayer is number one. And last week I remember one of you had asked about discipline. One thing I forgot to mention about discipline was that the best way, if you want everything else to fall in line and to have discipline, to have your priorities straight, is to make sure that your prayers get your most undivided attention. And try this. I give this homework assignment a lot, which is, when you make your schedule, you know how we make like a to-do list, or we make our schedule for the next day? Try to, when you put the date, put Bismillah on top, and then first thing you write, the prayer times, okay? And then fill in the gaps. What you did already is that you've set your mindset and you've set your intention that everything else in my life revolves around your prayer. I personally tried this. The challenge is to be consistent with it, but it does wonders to the days that I have tried it. It's because it just put everything else in perspective. And there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you put him first, he starts to take care of your affairs, And so one of the best ways to be disciplined is to put Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first, and it starts with the prayer. It starts with letting Allah, or making the intention that my day, first of all, why do we have this day? It's because it's another chance for us to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So we all love to be organized. We want to be those people that get things done and are efficient. Have we ever tried to say, you know what? I'm going to do this between Fajr and Dhuhr. Not I'm going to pray Dhuhr between my physics assignment and my other assignment. The language we speak reflects a lot. The language we tell ourselves, the things that we internalize, the messages that we say to ourselves about how we even approach our day and how we approach our life says a lot. So prayer is definitely the biggest and hugest component. And all these other things, morning and evening dhikr, they have so many verses in there just about protection and about things that, like I said, there's so many things going on, seen and unseen, from within you, outside of you, that that we really need to, honestly, it all goes back to we really need to own our deen, okay? We need to own the fact that Allah has equipped us with everything we need to live a peaceful life, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. But the thing is that we really don't own it. And I think it's because maybe we have separated it within our brains, like this is deen and then everything else, but we have to look at our deen as the starting point for everything. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be the starting point for everything. And when we go to people, when they have mental, emotional issues, sometimes they don't even want to hear about what Islam has to offer because they think it's a separate issue, right? And I'm not saying that I'm not saying not to get help. I don't want anyone to ever think that I'm not saying if you have a psychological issue or a mental, emotional issue, to not go to a therapist. No, because our deen says we have to be proactive, right? Just like I gave the example about if we had a physical issue, right? But we also have to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what I'm going through, and that you have to turn to Allah. Allah is the source of every physical cure, right? So Allah is the source of every emotional, mental agitation as well. But we have to look into our deen and we have to own it, and we have to see, first, what am I doing that could be maybe the cause of what's happening? Because there are self-imposed illnesses, right? And then there are ones that happen to us, right? For example, physical issues. If you're constantly eating bad and then you get diabetes, right? That's something that you knew that maybe you brought upon yourself because of the way you can identify, like I've been eating this way, right? But then there are people who say like are healthy or there's no cause and then they get cancer, right? That's something that happened to them. But there are a lot of things that are self-imposed because we do not do the things that were prescribed to us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we don't own them in a way that like we know that this is powerful, right? And I always think of excuse me. I always think of the story of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, when he was traveling and he was going to Jerusalem to get the keys of Jerusalem, right? So this is like a big honor. And as he was walking to Jerusalem, something happened where he let his servant ride his camel, or I'm not sure what type of ride it was, but he let his servant ride, and he was the one that was pulling the animal. And I guess along the way he fell in mud, and I guess his clothes got dirty. And when he reached there, one of the men who saw him, he got really upset. He said, they're here to honor you, and you know, this is the way you look. You know what Umar ibn al-Khattab said? He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has honored us we were the most humiliated nation, like people, and Allah has honored us through Islam. And if we seek honor through any other way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will humiliate us again. And this is in everything, right? You know, feel proud of your deen. It's perfect. It's perfect, it's complete. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I have, الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتَ عَلَيْكُمْ دِينَكُمْ I've completed this way of life for you, I've completed this deen for you. Hold on to it. You know, how many times do we only appreciate something of our deen when we hear like somebody else or the media say it, right? Like the whole thing about halal food, right? When it came out in the news, that woman who was bashing Butterball. I don't know if you guys have heard of the story. Butterball is a company in the U.S. that actually like slaughters its meat the halal way, takes care of its meat the halal way. And so one of the ladies came on TV and was like telling everybody, don't buy it because it's halal, it's Islamicized, and all this stuff. And this guy comes on and he says, it was on one of the news channels. He says, okay, let's go over what halal means. It means to treat the animals right. It means to slaughter it in a way it's humane. It means to feed it right, to take care of it right. He's like, we should all be eating halal. And then of course everybody's like, yeah, like what? We don't need to wait for people to tell us that our deen is beautiful. We need to own it. And Allah will not change a nation until we change what is in themselves. And this is honestly the motivation of knowing ourselves and knowing who we are and trying to change our hearts from within, because everything that you're seeing that's happening to us and in the world is a reflection of our own hearts. Think of anything that happens, this is empowering. It's empowering because this is a sign that we need to look within, and that we need to reflect on what is it that I'm doing? How is the state of my heart? We should worry about the state of the ummah, but worry more about the state of something you can actually like have more power over, which is begin with yourself. And if we look at the Sahaba and we look at like even the early scholars of Islam, Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Ibn Sina, all these people that contributed to like this huge movement in Europe that contributed to their advancement. There was a time when Muslim scholars from all over the world would travel to study, and not Muslim scholars, scholars from other religious backgrounds, from other, even Christian scholars who were really knowledgeable, who would go study under Muslims. Because there was a point in time where we were the highest at efficiently and methodologically trying to seek knowledge. And we valued that because we knew that when we say La ilaha illallah, and when we're motivated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we're proactive, and we want to help and we want to benefit not just ourselves, but we want to benefit everybody around us, Muslim or non-Muslim, right? But we won't be able to do anything unless you own yourself, you get a hold of your heart. And the first way to start getting a hold of your heart is to follow these basic things, which is to pray, to do dhikr, to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I want to go back to the diagram a little bit to talk about we said that if this initial layer, this outer layer, is expanded, right, and it's filled with goodness, sincerity, and a key part of this layer is your sincere intentions, okay? Because good actions come from what? Depending on what? Your intentions. Al-a'malu binniyat, right? So this area, it's not just about, okay, yeah, it's what we do, but why are we doing things we do? So it's a conscious awareness. So if this area is good, then the other areas will also expand, will also grow. And what's interesting is that when you do dhikr, you are softening, you are leading to that expansion, okay? When you do dhikr and you're remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, goodness always prevails over evil, right? Because goodness is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And He's the one who's going to, like, once you remember Him, and that strength is going to overpower anything, but we have to be consistent in doing it. But what happens, oh, I didn't even get it back, I'm sorry. I keep using the keyboard for my laptop. What's really interesting is that in Western psychology, they say the intellect is all in the brain, right? But Islamic psychology says that the heart actually has the ability to perceive and to understand and to intellectualize. You know, a lot of and if we reflect on the Quran, we'll notice that a lot of the verses doesn't say for the mind to reflect. A lot of the verses says for the heart to reflect, you know? And there's even an ayah, that famous ayah in Surah Al-Imran, about in the alternation of, not a famous ayah, I'm sorry, a known ayah, in the alternation of night and day, and then it talks about all the signs of the universe. And then at the end it says, basically signs for ulil albab, right? These are signs. Hello?
I think it's going to be for Salat al-Ashr.
Oh, really? Okay. So, should I stop here or? Okay, so let me keep going then. Basically, is that you could absorb all of these things intellectually. How many of us have gathered knowledge, right? And how many do we see the smartest people have gathered knowledge, but they still don't understand the meaning of this world? This is what the heart can perceive. When you are doing dhikr, you are breaking these barriers. You're allowing yourself to perceive more, because the heart perceives truth. It perceives something that the mind cannot perceive. The mind is a logical, rational being. It absorbs, processes. But where do we derive the meaning, the truth from the world, you know? When, you know, like Nauman Ali Khan was talking about the concept of nur, and when Allah puts nur in someone's heart, He says that a believer sees things differently, right? A believer who has nur from Allah in his heart sees things differently. Then he says you could have two people, one looking at a tree, one who has a PhD of trees, of tree science, and one who is a believer, right? And they'll see that tree completely different. One will see that tree for the truth of what it is, right? And one will see it with a very limited perspective. But this all goes back to feeding our heart and remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constantly, so that we're able, those other areas, they have different abilities. Remember I said how every one of those areas houses a light, right? One of those areas, like that innermost one, it's often referred to as al-lub, right? And in that ayah it says li'uli al-albab, for those who reflect. But lub is actually, it has a much deeper meaning than just reflection. It's intellect, reflection, it's ability to perceive. Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the signs and say li'uli al-albab, for those who reflect, right? And this innermost area is often referred to as al-lub, which, because Islamic psychology recognizes that this heart, when it's connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it has the ability to derive meaning and to perceive things that you wouldn't have perceived if you weren't close to Allah, right? And this is a perfect example, is all of those people who have the most advanced brains we know, but they have not understood that they are here for a purpose, right? They have not understood that this knowledge I'm seeking, they have not translated it into a meaning in their life that can bring them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is crucial, you know, whether it's through prayer, it's through dhikr, it's through any of the things that you are trying to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more. And the benefits of dhikr is that perfect verse is أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. Verily in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest, right? And you know, when the Rasul they were going through some tough times, he would always tell Bilal, who would do the adhan, to get up and to give him comfort through the salah. He would tell him to start the prayer. How many of us, when we're distressed, go pray 2 rakahs? Or sit with ourselves and we do some dhikr, right? Because our nafs doesn't want to do that. Because then what? In those moments, what does our nafs want? Maybe sometimes it just wants to vent it out, right? Because the emotion is strong, right? And sometimes our nafs can't even handle it. How many times have you seen someone who is so internally distraught that they bring out their anger out on other people, right? Because it has to go somewhere. You can either let that nafs, take control of it, but it's going to come out. That nafs is going to use it, and it's going to come out in the wrong way. But if you let the heart take action in those moments, those are the best moments for you to give strength to your heart. Because in those moments, that's when you're like feeding it, and that's when you're going to feel, because whenever you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah gives you strength, and Allah will give you that raha. Because Allah says, verily in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest. So you definitely do feel that tranquility, but it has to be a practice. What we do is that we put it on the sidelines, and we use it only in extreme situations, and then we say, well, why do I have anxiety, and why do I have these things? I mean, anxiety, all these things are part of life on a certain level, Of course, when they get to a certain point, they can become disorders, but we all go through these emotions. We get sad sometimes, We get anxious sometimes about the future. These emotions are part of our life. I mean, if we were perfectly happy, then this would be Jannah, but it's not. So, but to regulate it, to know that I have these tools. I mean, try it. Try one day, 2 assignments. Try the first one to set your schedule within the framework of salah, okay? And to revolve your daily life around those prayers. And then the other thing is to try to, whenever you are maybe agitated or down, try to take 2 minutes and sit down, say maybe even Alhamdulillah, right? Or Astaghfirullah, or Subhanallah, or Allahu Akbar. God is greater than this problem that I'm going through. God is greater than whatever calamity or whatever situation I see, He is greater. And isn't that what we say when we start salah? We say, Allahu Akbar. You could almost imagine that you're throwing away behind you everything that that you're worried about. You say, God is greater. So I guess I'll stop here, and inshallah next week we'll continue more on the benefits of dhikr. But I'll take questions now, inshallah. Yes?
I read it once that subhanallah, when we say astaghfirullah before we go to sleep, and subhanallah, the glands, I think somewhere, if we release some kind of substance that can relieve the brain or something like that, subhanallah. So
Definitely. They actually did research on the recitation of Quran along with therapy with people. It calms, remember how I said this heart within us, it already recognizes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's why you have non-Muslims. I had a classmate who recently I put on the Quran, and she was about to break down crying. She was like, what is that? And she never heard it before. I had a friend also who went into work one day, and she heard the Quran playing. So she followed the sound, and when she got to the office, she was just asking the guy, her coworker, what are you listening to see if he knew. He says, I don't know, but I came across this, and I can't stop listening to it. I have so many more stories about this, people who heard Quran that never heard it. There's definitely a response to it. Allah put in us that response, that longing, that it's something that's familiar. And they did so much research about dhikr and what it does to your body. It definitely calms you. There's so much about that, subhanAllah. Yes.
Going back to what you were saying about the heart and how Islamic psychology says that we cannot perceive. You just reminded me of what my bio class, my professor was saying that they're now discovering neurons in the heart, which neurons that are in the brain that send messages to the
know, as people get into more research, there's always something that comes out that just supports what the Quran teaches. Just like the embryo, how Allah teaches us the stages of the embryo, and how in Canada they totally absorb that that understanding of the embryo, like scientists in Canada. But yeah, like as research continues, that's why I say, like, I don't want us to wait until we hear other people. We should own it, so Allah could honor us, you know, and Allah could allow us to use that for Him.
Allahu Akbar.